want to welcome you to the fourth and final session of this afternoon's, of today's panels. This one, as you know, is devoted to biology and public policy. Our principal speaker who will kick off the panel is Ruth Schwartz Cowan, one of the three co-authors of the sesquicentennial history of the Academy. She is recently retired from the Janice and Julian Bears Professorship of the History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She has devoted her career as a scholar and educator to understanding the social meaning of scientific, technological, and medical change. She is the author of a classic prize-winning book called More Work for Mother, about the history of the domestic technologies in the home. Her most recent book is Heredity and Hope, the Case for Genetic Screening. She's exceptionally well-versed in the history of biology in society, not only in the past, but also in the present. So it is a pleasure to turn the microphone over to Ruth Cowan.
I really meant what I said at the close of the morning session, that all of us who are working on the 150th year history have learned an enormous amount. Have learned an enormous amount from the proceedings so far. So much so that I have revised my text twice. And I am saying that in order to warn the panel that what I sent as my text is going to sound different when I deliver it. So I chose 3 incidents in the history of biology and public policy that particularly focus on the activities of the National Academy of Science. And I'm going to tell those stories as part of my talk today, but I'm going to tell them to illustrate 2 themes that I want to focus on. The first I hadn't intended to focus on, but I was so inspired by Dan Kevlis's talk last night that I added it to this theme to my address this afternoon. And that is the theme of tension. That there is a tension between the original and current goals of the Academy. That is the goal of providing advice to government, which requires, as Dan pointed out last night, both oversight and accountability. And the other goal of supporting good science and the people who do it. Because that requires something quite different. That requires academic freedom, that is, the freedom to do research without political control or interference. So that's my first theme, tensions. The second theme is interests, which was the only theme of my written text that I sent to the panelists. Sociologists of knowledge have taught us that people have both social and economic interests in knowledge. In fact, they've gone further, and they've said that everyone has a bias of some sort. Even those of us, and I include myself in this judgment, who practice what we think of as disinterested scholarship. 2 themes, tension and interests, and I will try to interweave them into the stories I'm about to tell. The first story has to do with 2 reports that were issued by the Academy actually the second one was issued by the National Research Council, respectively in 1963 and 1965. The title of the first one, which will surprise some of you in the audience, was The Growth of the World Population, Analysis of the Problems and Recommendations for Research and Training. The second one, published 2 years later, Growth of the U.S. Population, Analysis of the Problem and Recommendations for Research, Training, and Service, issued in 1965. Briefly put, both reports came to the same conclusion, namely that there was a population crisis and it was going to happen sooner, or there was a population crisis in the world's future. It was going to happen sooner rather than later. And the solution, what would avert this crisis, both in the world and in the United States, these crises, they were different, both in the world and in the United States, was contraception. And more research about contraception, and more training for those who would teach families how to and why to use contraception. I use the word families on purpose because you can read both reports and never discover that it was women who were supposed to be using the contraceptives. The pronoun her never appears. But that's not my point. Both of these reports were intended for public dissemination. They were not to be behind the scenes. The intended audience was quite clearly, from internal records in the archives, Congress. But there was also a wider audience hoped for. And so both reports were accompanied by press releases, and both documents were sent to all members of Congress, but also to all of the responsible media, not just in the nation, but worldwide. It's not an accident that the first report, the first Committee on Population, was a subcommittee of COSPUP, that is, the Committee on Science and Public Policy. In fact, the first report, the one in 1963, was the first report that COSPUP ever issued. The Committee on Population was transferred out of COSPUP for reasons I can't quite figure out, and transferred to the NRC so that when the second report was published, it was signed by the Committee on Population of the National Research Council. The names of the members of the committee were never used. They do not appear in either one of the reports. But the archives reveal that neither the chair nor a majority of the members were experts, either on medical aspects of contraception or on social aspects of dissemination of information. Both of these reports appear to use a term we've been using a lot in the last 2 days. Both appear to have been efficacious. To what extent they influenced Congress, it's hard to tell, but it is nonetheless the case that in those years, beginning in 1963 and stretching into the latter part of the 60s, Congress authorized the expenditure of funds through the Agency for International Development, through AID, for the purchase of contraceptive devices and the dissemination of contraceptive information throughout the undeveloped world. It's also the case that the Medicaid legislation, which was being debated as the first of these two reports came out, ultimately contained provisions that Medicaid could offer at subsidized cost. It could offer its patients contraceptive devices and contraceptive counseling. It's also the case that in those years, both NIH and NSF offered special program grants to particularly departments of demography. I like to think of them as maybe the disciplinary encouragement acts of the disciplining encouragement grants for the discipline of demography. However, and this is more to the point of my story, both reports were scientifically flawed. They were even an embarrassment in their scientific flaws. There was a plan for the Committee on Population that had issued the first two to do a joint report with the Royal Society, and several joint meetings were held both in the United States and in Great Britain. of the corresponding committees on population. But just, that is one committee of the National Academy of Sciences, one committee of the Royal Society. Just as the reports were to be given their final draft, the Royal Society pulled out. And that final report was never published, in part because of the criticisms of the scientific quality of the component parts of the report. Both were scientifically flawed, and those flaws immediately were identified in the professional literature, particularly of demography, but also in the professional literature of sociology. There were some demographers who questioned whether, in fact, there was a crisis brewing, either in the undeveloped world or in the United States. They had not been consulted. There were some sociologists and demographers who both questioned whether or not voluntary contraception, which is what the reports advocated, would ever do the job, and whether or not contraception in and of itself would be a solution to the problem. So in the professional literature, both of demography and of sociology, the reports were passionately criticized and particularly generated the sense in these criticisms that the reports themselves had been politically generated and politically biased. That's case number one. Case number two is the Academy's role in the original controversy about the safety of what was then called gene splicing, that is, the first recombinant DNA experiments. We're now a decade later. Between the fall of 1971 and the summer of 1973, several research groups at Stanford University had succeeded in the first instance in splicing the DNA from a bacterial virus with the DNA from a monkey tumor virus. And the person who led the team that did that Paul Berg, intended to use the bacterial virus as a vector to insert the tumor virus into the bacterium Escherichia coli, which, as you are probably aware, normally inhabits the human gut. Subsequently, two other groups working together and separately at Stanford succeeded in introducing antibiotic resistance genes. That is, they coupled together two different antibiotic resistance genes from plasmids and inserted them into the same vector, E. coli. Herbert Boyer's group eventually succeeded in inserting a gene from a toad, that is, from a higher level, quote, higher level organism, into a bacterium, namely Escherichia coli. Which means that by the summer of 1973, a certain holy grail for molecular biology had been accomplished. And that is that it was now conceivable that bacteria, which, as we all know, reproduce very fast, that bacteria could be used, and now I'm going to use three different terms, two of them scientific and one of them common. That is, bacteria could be used to synthesize, express, or as we might otherwise say, produce medications. Investment capitalists, or people who provide investment capital, entrepreneurs, universities, particularly what came to be called the Offices of Technology Transfer, and established pharmaceutical companies understood what was happening. A Gordon conference was held in the summer of 1973. One of the chairs of that conference is a member of our panel, Maxine Singer. The other chair was Dieter Zoll. Herb Boyer gave a talk about his ability to transfer the gene from a toad into a bacterium. And the problem of the safety of these experiments was publicly, that is within the community of molecular biologists, raised. There was so much alarm that Dr. Singer and Dr. Zoll, Dieter Zoll was the co-chair of the conference, wrote a letter within a week after the conference concluded to Phil Handler, who was the president of the NAS. And that letter was subsequently published in a September issue of Science magazine, specifically asking the National Academy of Sciences to convene a study committee to assess the risks of, and a study committee not entirely composed of the people at the Gordon Conference, to assess the risks of this research, not only to the health of the people working in laboratories, but also to the health of the public, and to make recommendations that, about how to proceed with the research. I'm not sure, Maxine, whether there was in that letter a request that there be a postponement of all the experiments. Was there? In the original letter that you wrote? No. Okay. There was some delay, the archives reveal, in decision-making at the National Academy of Sciences, but eventually, about 6 months later, Phil Handler and the Academy governing bodies finally decided to back the molecular biologists who thought that transparency was the socially responsible thing to do when a scientific community understood itself to be dealing with something which was a risk to the public health. And I'd just like to list briefly for you the various things that the Academy did to back up the desire of these molecular biologists to have a public or professionally public discussion of what to do next. The National Academy of Sciences convened that study committee. When that study committee concluded its deliberations, which was about the spring of 1974, it not only encouraged publication of the conclusions, they were published as a letter in the Proceedings of the National Academy in Science and in Nature, but it also, and this is crucial, convened a press conference so as to explain the contents of the letter to the News Corps, the Scientific News Corps, before the letter was actually published. The Academy organized the conference at Asilomar, which occurred in January 1975, and sought the funding, put together the funding that made the conference possible. However, the files also reveal that this group, and I'm going to call them, for want of a better term, the Asilomar molecular biologists, did not constitute the whole of the community of molecular biologists. There was an awful lot of criticism rendered about what those molecular biologists had decided to do and about the Academy's decision to back them up. The criticism, and this is from members of the Academy, not from members of the public. The criticism, some people said, that the biologists, the Asilomar molecular biologists, had exaggerated the risks to public health. Some said that the benefits of the research were worth the risk, whatever it was. Others argued that the problems in the research could be and were best solved. Oh my goodness. I only have 2 minutes left, and I've got yet another example. Okay. There was dissension about transparency and the wisdom of transparency. Some molecular biologists argued that making this discussion transparent, making it public, was going to lead to attempts to have the public regulation of scientific activity, which of course is precisely what happened, as many of you know, so I will skip over the details for the moment. The controversy eventually died down. In fact, it had died down by the end of the 1970s, but it lives on retrospectively in the writings of historians, both professional and amateurs. And it raises the question, I would argue, about the tension between public service as a goal and the tension between promoting scientific activity as a goal. It raises the question, in short, whether in a democracy you can serve the interests of the public and of the scientific community at the same time. My last example concerns the policy of using conflict of interest criteria for membership on study committees and the policy of having members of study committees sign conflict of interest statements. That policy, that story goes back to the same year, 1972, as my previous example, but it has to do with a piece of legislation that was passed by Congress in 1972, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, otherwise known as FACA. That piece of legislation was passed by Congress in the effort to make advisory committees to the federal agencies of the federal government, including itself, both independent, and hence the conflict of interest criterion, and transparent, hence the decision that henceforth deliberations of scientific advisory committees were going to have to be held open to the public, at least partially. Now, the National Academy of Science and the National Research Council, being private institutions, are exempt from FACA. But after long executive council deliberations, over the course of many years, actually starting in the 60s, the National Academy of Sciences and the National Research Council decided to require, not public deliberations, but to require conflict of interest considerations in making appointments to study committees and conflict of interest statements that had to be signed by the members of those committees. Ironically, the opponents of conflict of interest statements on the various executive boards of the National Academy said exactly the same thing in their deliberations that the sociologists of knowledge tell us, namely, that everyone has some kind of interest in the conclusions of a study. So worrying about conflict of interest would only slow down the process, and also make it harder to get the best people to serve on committees. And I will very briefly tell you the story of one such committee and the paradoxes into which, I guess not very briefly, I'll sum up by saying there's just one committee in which I examined this happened. It was a committee that was requested by members of the Academy. It was not requested by outside agencies, but it was put together when the EPA decided to issue regulations about certain genetically modified organisms. So when the staff people made nominations or suggested nominations to the president of the Academy, they were very careful to exclude people who were employees of the companies that were making the organisms and people who belonged to not-for-profit consumer advocacy organizations who opposed the making of those organisms. The names of the potential committee, the nominees, were made public. When they were made public, there was a protest from these not-for-profit organizations that were consumer advocates. And as a result of the protest, one of the signatories, one of the persons who signed those protest letters, was appointed to the committee in direct contradiction to what the staff people had suggested to the president. Over the course of time, one of the staff people resigned and went to work for the biotechnology organization, a lobbying effort. At which point, the person who had been appointed to the committee leaked the story of his resignation and the committee's deliberations to the New York Times. Which leads me to conclude that the process of imposing conflict of interest criteria and statements on committees is simply a joke. And it leads me further to conclude, and I'll explain if I need to more about this in the discussion, that the tension between the public goals of the Academy and the, we might say, private goals of the Academy, that is to support the scientific community and excellence in science, is in fact not resolvable, and happily so, because it is a creative tension that has resulted in very good work for the public. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Our first respondent is Jane Maienschein. Jane is Regents Professor and Director for the Center for Biology and Society at Arizona State University, where she specializes in the history and philosophy of biology and the way that biology, bioethics, and biopolicy have threaded their way into and impacted our society. She's the author of a number of scholarly works, and starting with the study of Ross Harrison, an embryologist at Yale, whom I mention because he also became chair of the National Research Council during World War II. Her other works include Whose View of Life, Embryos, Cloning, and Stem Cells, and From Embryology to Evo Devo, A History of Developmental Evolution. Jane.
On Academy committees, even though those have been quite interesting. And I'm not really going to talk about my expertise in history of developmental biology, though thanks to Dan for mentioning Ross Harrison, who I love. Ross Harrison was the first ever to do stem cell experiment in 1907, and the first ever to do tissue culture. And in fact, his research in his very last years changed substantially because of his service on the National Research Council. He changed his work so that he embraced wound repair and talked about the importance of doing what has become called regenerative medicine. So there's a story there, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. What I want to do, because I was trying to think of something that I knew how to do when I got these distinguished guys here who are really experts on many things. So I'm going to talk about the view from the trenches. So in 1997 and 98, I served in a capacity with a congressional office. I was a congressional fellow. I served as a staff member. The committee, the main committee that the Congressman Matt Salmon was on was a science committee, and he said, I know nothing about science, so I need somebody to help me. So I was an advisor. It's extremely valuable and very educational to serve in the office of somebody who at the time wanted to get rid of Kermit the Frog and now wants to close down the government. Very conservative, fiscally conservative guy, but very smart, who was interested in learning about science. So I want to look at three examples. That was the Gingrich era. The Office of Technology Assessment had recently been closed, and so I just want to look at three examples quickly and talk about issues of expertise, audience, and what's the message, or communicating about what. So the first, questions of expertise and authority, and this ties to our last panel, with issues of the environment, who do we believe as the experts or authority? Is it the 3-foot pile deep stuff that's come from all of the scientific experts and the NRC reports, or is it the book by Dixie Lee Ray, the former governor of Washington, that Newt Gingrich was giving everybody and saying, this is the authority, she knows about science, and so listen to her. So you have a 3-foot pile of stuff with a bunch of different reports and a lot of different leaflets from a lot of different people, or you have one thing that you're being told as the is the source, or the source of authority. So how do you establish authority? The OTA had been closed. The Congressional Research Service was a place to go for expertise on some things, and the National Research Council for some things. It's regarded as solid in some areas, but suspect in others. For example, this was a time when there was Kyoto hearings, lots of issues about emissions, lots of discussion about climate change and warming. So one of the hearings was about warming and the probable impact on biodiversity in particular. The hearing had 4 experts and about 4 congressmen listening, sort of the usual. Well, 4 is more than many, but, and the experts presented 4 models. And at the end, the intelligent congressmen who were there were some, said, what would it take to know which of these models is best? Or what would it take to establish that they're accurate? And each of the 4 experts said, as Spencer suggested they would, more money, but not just more money for science, more money for my research, they each said. They all wanted more money for their own research. So the congressman pushed them and said, all right, well, which of you is the expert? You're disagreeing about what's going on here and how to understand it. And then there was a hearing, so that sort of ended. Then there was a meeting where there were staff from the NRC, and they were having a briefing, and they were talking about this hearing and others. And some of the staff members said, okay, which of the experts can we trust? Which one is right? And the experts said, oh, well, really what we need is more money to figure out which ones to understand and to accept. And so the idea of what expertise or what authority we have was very muddled in that case, where it was clear that the academy and the scientists want to be experts, but they're having trouble playing that role and having trouble explaining what statistics mean and uncertainty and that sort of thing, how we make decisions under uncertainty. So that's the first example, that issues of expertise and authority are tricky from the trenches. And it's not just that people are willfully going, man, I don't want to listen. The second is really about what the role is of the academies and the National Research Council and the reports. Is Congress really the intended audience? That's said a number of times, and some of the reports even suggest that if they were commissioned by Congress. Is the goal really to communicate? We've heard already today a number of examples that, in fact, the impact of many of the reports is more important outside of Congress, and yet if we're addressing them toward Congress, then really what are we thinking, or what are we doing when we do that? And there are questions about why do we need yet another report at times when there are other reports out there. And so this was an example with science education standards. We already had Project 2061 from the AAAS, and yet it was important somehow for the NRC to produce their set of standards or their report. And yes, there's a role for that, but from the outside, from people in Congress, from the public, they say, why? Didn't we just waste a lot of money doing another study when we already had one? Why are the experts at the Academy better than the experts at the AAAS, or what's the difference? So issues about what's the real audience and how we're meeting that audience raises a lot of questions. There's a lot of talk about communicating and the importance of communicating with society, but how, with whom are we trying to communicate, and how are we doing it really? And there's not really quite a clear sense of what the purpose, as I say, what the audience is for the NRC reports. This was true not with NRC reports yet, but in earlier discussions leading up to them with issues of cloning and stem cell research, which were both hot when I was at Congress, which was great fun since that's my field. There was a lot of noise, and in fact, Gingrich and others said, oh, we don't need an NRC report, we don't need to appeal to the academies because we have a bioethics committee. So we'll listen to the president's bioethics committee, even though it was Clinton, but they still thought that was better than the academies, which is interesting. So it's probably not the case that successfully hitting Congress as the target audience. I think it would be worthwhile for those of you who are writing this great book that we're all going to look forward to, and it will be wonderful It would be worth looking at changes over time in the way that Congress has received these reports. So not just what did they ask for, but how did they receive them? What got quoted, what got cited in any congressional records, or made a difference. Congressional records don't matter, but actually made a difference otherwise. So what was the reception? What was the impact of the different reports would be worthwhile. And also looking at reports that really have taken a long time, so they're not the quick response that often is needed, but do they have impact later? So understanding that would be useful. And also, as Maxine suggested this morning, sometimes they may have impact because of a leader who really takes the report forward, and there have been cases of that. So trying to look and see which ones have that sort of advocacy for them, or which ones make a difference and for whom, I think would be useful. So that's a research question for you guys to address, and then the third point is just about how the science is presented. So what is the message, and what are we actually trying to communicate? Naomi, of course, has talked much about consensus with climate change. Bruce Alberts talked a lot about consensus with evolution, why we have to teach evolution, why 10,000 scientists were involved in making up statements about evolution, and therefore it has to be right. And so that's fine. Those are strong messages, but those come alongside one staff-directed meeting that I heard where there were social scientists invited by some of the staff from the academy. So Naomi, social scientists are not always helpful. They started talking about the social construction of knowledge, and they led the group to conclude that, in fact, science is just a constructed set of knowledge, just like any other constructed set of knowledge. And so why can't they construct it as well as the scientists, and why should they believe the academy? So what we're communicating, what messages we're communicating, as well as to whom and for what purpose, are all things to understand, and to look at the effort over time and discussion about communication and what the goals are, I think is really important, and I look forward to everything that all you people doing the work find out. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Elliot Meyerowitz. He's the George W. Beadle Professor of Biology at Caltech, one of my favorite institutions. His research, as many of you know, was crucial in establishing Arabidopsis as a model plant for molecular genetic studies. He is a longstanding member of the National Academy of Sciences, has served on the Governing Council and many committees in the Academy, such as the Committee on a New Biology for the 21st Century. He just returned from 2 years in Cambridge University in England, where he was helping to develop a biological research program. Is that correct, Elliot? Pardon?
A new institute.
Yeah, a new institute devoted to biology, and so he brings a special international academic perspective to our subject. So, Elliot.
Thank you very much. I want to make 4 brief points, 2 of which I'm afraid will directly contradict Ruth's recommendation that we no longer have conflict of interest statements in National Research Council or NAS committees, and the last one will really only be a re-emphasis of what Jane just said, which I think is the central point in considering this. That is, for whom are we writing the reports? So my first point on conflict of interest is to make clear, it should be made clear, that the object of the committee procedures that have been instituted over the past decades for NAS and NRC reports that treat conflict of interest, and the first meeting of these, of any of these committees, is given over to people discussing their conflicts, their biases, and signing conflict of interest reports. And this part of the meeting is always taped. It's preserved forever, and I presume is in the archives. And the point of this isn't to eliminate bias or to eliminate conflicts of interest. The point of this exercise is to balance biases and to balance conflicts so that in the end, conflicts or any appearance of them, I mean, if it were even possible to eliminate members with any conflict, as Ruth points out, that would eliminate everyone. So the point of the traditional discussion of bias and conflicts is to balance bias and conflicts, not to avoid them, so that a consensus report has had the benefit of different points of view and reflects a consensus, if one is achieved, that's acceptable to the committee members regardless of the side of a public argument in which they find themselves. And so for this reason, the conflict discussion really is important. It apprises the staff and the members of the committee of pre-existing points of view that can be discussed in the committee and that can be balanced against other points of view in the written report, and that allows a critical and very important assessment of whether all sides of the scientific argument are present among the committee members. One other policy or practice for NRC reports is that there's a report review afterwards, where a completely separate set of people who are not members of the committee or who are experienced in committee discussions and in writing these reports consider the report in depth, make certain that the scientific statements in it are well supported, and that all points of view are presented. And so I think it's critical to have these discussions, and that they're not useless because they lead to a report that's balanced. Now, one other thing I should say about the social construction of scientific knowledge is that the explicit statements in that form of research, at least in the strong programs in that area, that everybody has interests, are probably true. But implicit in that is that everybody will act on their worst or lowest interests, which I think probably is not true. In my experience on NRC committees is that people try as hard as they can to set aside their biases and to listen to other people to try and really achieve an appropriate consensus, or at least to define those areas where it's possible to achieve a consensus. And so that the statements of conflict serve to eliminate hidden biases, which are the ones that are suspect. And I think after that, we can count on the integrity of committee members to do their best not to try and insert their biases and personal opinions in a consensus report. There's a second point I want to discuss. It's a more trivial point, I think, but I want to bring it up because Ruth talked about two different types of reports: National Academy of Science reports and National Research Council reports. The reports that are put out by the academies have different origins. Some have a group of sponsors who can be government agencies, sometimes industry groups, any other sort of group, and others are funded and run by the academy itself. And I think it's important to know that there are these two types of reports, and that if it's possible, the academy should do more of its own reports. Now, this takes money. I'm not here to make a fundraising pitch. We've all heard this many times from the academy. But if the academy had an endowment sufficient to fund a dozen more reports a year, 15 more reports a year, it would first of all have the effect of allowing the members of the academies to establish what they think is important for NRC reports, rather than being told what they can advise the government upon. And while that may be opening a Pandora's box, I think it would make the entire exercise of more interest to the members of the academies and to the scientists whom in some ways they're representing. And it would also assure more participation by members of the academies in the committees, which sometimes is rather sparse. And so I think the committees and the academy would both benefit by the academy sponsoring more of its reports on topics that scientists find of overwhelming interest, even though the reports on constituents of pet foods and those sorts of things are also very important. And there was actually quite a flap over conflict of interest in the 2006 pet food report, but I won't go into that. My third point was we discussed the origin of committees and the importance of the academy being able to commission its own reports. I want to raise a different level of conflict of interest that has come up earlier in the discussion on national security very briefly. And this is the unwritten but not always unspoken rule that National Research Council committees should not directly, or at least severely, criticize any existing government programs. And the reason for this is so that the reports can be effective, because when somebody in a federal agency who has sponsored a report starts to read a harsh criticism of their own work, they certainly don't listen to the rest of it. But it also represents a bias or a conflict on the part of the National Research Council as a whole, which is the National Research Council needs repeat business. Its raison d'etre is to give advice to the government, unbiased and objective advice, but advice when asked to the government. And I think having an increased number of National Academy reports might, rather than NRC-sponsored reports, might make it possible at least to gently criticize some of the government programs for which that sort of criticism is avoided because of this real conflict that the NRC has with the sources of their business and their desire to have continued business, which creates a creative tension between the members of the committee, who often want to criticize what's gone before, and the staff, who are wise enough to know that that doesn't create an effective report. So I think not only should there be a discussion of conflict of interest of the committee members at the beginning of each NRC report, but there should be an open and frank discussion about the bias inherent in the fact that the National Research Council wants to maintain the business of their sponsors and therefore is delicate about criticisms of previous government programs and of previous reports sent to the government. So all three of my points, which is that interest should be balanced but can't be avoided, and that we can count at some level on the integrity of the people on the committee, and we shouldn't simply doubt that and their honesty, that the source of reports is important, and that it would be good if we had more reports that came from the Academy in addition to the reports from the National Research Council. And my third point, that there's another level of conflict that's rarely discussed but should be discussed, this conflict of the NRC itself in terms of its sponsors. Lead me up to what Jane already said, which is that all of these points really depend on the fourth point, which is a question that should be, I think, at the heart of some of our discussions that follow this panel, which is, for whom are the NRC and NAS reports written? Are they written for the sponsors? Well, I suppose the pet food report was, and that was actually the objection to it, because it allowed in what was called complete and nutritious pet foods, ingredients that were not certified fit for human consumption. And there were some pet advocates who objected to this and felt that that bias had arisen because one of the many sponsors of the committee was the pet food industry. Is it the members of the academies who are the people who are supposed to be getting the reports and for whom the reports are written? Sometimes I think we're writing them for each other. Is it scientists in general? The reports are generally, sometimes they're at quite a serious technical level, and so that it would take some degree of expertise to really read them and understand everything, and so that some of the reports really do seem to be written for other scientists. Is it for journalists? We've talked a lot in this meeting about communicating to the general public, and the award ceremony that was before this meeting was awarding writers and journalists for doing wonderful service to science by talking about important scientific problems to the general public. Is that for whom our reports are written? Is it for the journalists so that they can then take the next step and inform the general public of what's in the reports? Or is it really for the general public? I didn't even say Congress, because that point has already been made, but are the reports for the general public? Are they for members of Congress? Well, of course not, but they might be for members of the congressional staff who will look at them. And so I think the answer to this question, in the end, would determine where both of Ruth's points, her point about interest and her point about tension, and where all of my points really end up being judged. And so I think the serious question is, for whom are we writing these reports? Maybe different ones should be written for different constituencies, and maybe that should be put in the report. And so with that, I'll stop, leave that discussion point open, and turn the floor over.
Thank you, Elliot. Last but by no means least on our panel this afternoon is Maxine Singer. Maxine is President Emerita of the Carnegie Institution for Science, but that hardly begins to speak to her, that description hardly begins to speak to her multiple accomplishments. If I could summarize them in perhaps one phrase, I would say that she is primus inter pares in the arena of science and public policy. Not that she has failed by any means to establish a distinguished scientific reputation before she got into that area. She cut her eye teeth on the development and research on the development of the genetic code. But then she went on, as Ruth mentioned, to play a major role in the debates over and the development of policy over recombinant DNA in the 1970s. Fittingly, she is the recipient of the National Academy's Public Welfare Medal, to quote the citation, in recognition of distinguished contributions in the application of science to the public welfare. This is the most prestigious honor conferred by the Academy, and it's an honor for me to introduce Maxine.
So that goes to prove that if you live long enough, you can do a lot of different things. Right. I wanted to start by putting a footnote to Ruth's comments about the 2 reports on population and contraception that were published by the Academy in 1963 and 1965. In addition to the interest at that time in Congress on such issues, I think it's useful to recognize that this issue was before the Supreme Court. And in 1965, in the case of Griswold versus the state of Connecticut, the court turned down Connecticut's law against the prescription and use of contraceptives. I no longer lived in Connecticut at the time, but I applauded the decision because in 1952, I went to New Haven as a beginning graduate student and a new bride. And I joined the many graduate students and faculty women and faculty wives who broke the law pretty much every day in the state of Connecticut. So I was interested in that case, and I think it's an interesting footnote to what you said. So, as Ruth has told you, I was very deeply involved in the whole discussion of the beginning of recombinant DNA experiments. And I thought I might just introduce some of my views by a quotation from Philippe Kurilsky, who is a biologist and who was the director of the Pasteur Institute. It goes like this: on the frontiers of the unknown, the analysis of benefits and hazards are locked up in concentric circles of ignorance. Without experimenting, without taking a minimum of risk, how could one determine the reality? And I think that pretty well sums up the general feelings that we all had in the 70s with respect to the introduction of recombinant DNA experiments. I think it's important to realize that laboratory safety was a well-known concern by then, not only well-known, but well-attended to. Perhaps not as well-attended to as it is now, but nevertheless, it was attended to. So, for example, it was important for chemists to avoid blowing everything up in the face of themselves and their colleagues. And it was also important to pay attention to the spread of chemicals around the room. And there were specific practices which, as a student of chemistry, one learned. Similarly, as a student of microbiology, one learned certain techniques that were designed for 2 reasons. One was to keep your experiment clean, by not infecting your experiment with unwanted organisms, and the other was to avoid infecting yourself or your lab mates. So there were practices in lab safety, and when the recombinant DNA situation arose, it didn't arise in a vacuum about appropriate laboratory techniques. I would like to also point out that Alan Needell this afternoon, or this morning, underscored the importance of dinner parties for the progress of science. He talked about a dinner party with Lloyd Berkner and James Van Allen. And so I thought I might tell you that there was a dinner party that figured in the recombinant DNA story. That dinner party happened to occur at my house, and it was when Paul Berg was first considering some of the experiments that Ruth already talked about. At the dinner party was another friend, Leon Cass, who was very interested in general in issues of bioethics and appropriate behavior for scientists. And there was an interesting conversation around the dinner table, only part of which I heard because I was also cooking and serving the dinner. And from that, I think, and from some other information that came to Paul from colleagues in various places, he actually dropped the experiments that he'd planned. And that was a background for what then happened 2 years later with respect to the recombinant DNA story. I thought I might just mention that after I brought to the Academy the concerns that were expressed at the Gordon Conference in the summer of 1973, the Academy had already, of course, seen the letter that was written by Dieter Zoll and I on behalf of the attendees. I should tell you that that letter was drafted while we were at the Gordon Conference. It was voted upon by the members of the conference, and then the members of the conference separately voted to make the letter public. But Dieter and I were concerned because some members of the conference had already left, and so both of those votes were repeated by mail ballot so that we had the votes of everyone before we set the letter and before we sent it to Science Magazine and Nature to be published. Apparently, there's some question about how public it is when you send something to Science or Nature. But of course, science journalists pick up most of their stories from those two journals, so that was certainly a way of publicizing it. And if we had any doubts about that, we were reminded by Phil Abelson, who was then the editor of Science Magazine, who immediately called and said, "Do you really want to do this? Because it will be public." And since we'd had the vote, Dieter and I told Phil, yes, we really want to do this. And Phil said, "Do you know what you're doing? You're going to have years of trouble." And of course, Phil was right. But indeed, we did publish it in order to make it all public. I know more about the history of Asilomar and the recombinant DNA developments and the development of the guidelines than you are all interested in, and I'm not going to bore you with it. I do want to end by pointing out something that Ruth said, which I was interested in. She posed the question, can you serve the interests of science and the public at the same time? And for me, the evidence says that many people in our country and around the world believe that that must be true because, for example, in our country, we have NASA, we have the National Science Foundation, we have the National Institutes of Health, we have the Department of Energy, we have NOAA, we have various public agencies funded with our tax money who serve the interests of science. And while one can argue with some things that are done sometimes, on the whole, I think our country and the world have benefited from the investments that the American taxpayer has made in science, which indeed have served the interests of the public. Thank you.
Following the pattern we've established in the 3 previous panels, we will now move to a discussion among the panelists and then open up the discussion to the audience at large. I would like to start off by just throwing out, lobbing a little bomb over into the panel. Which seems to me, and is generated by the consideration of what every one of you has said, namely, democracy is messy, okay? There's no efficient way to run a democratic society. So, for example, Jane, would you propose that instead of having multiple reports from a AAAS, from the NAS, from God knows what other sources, we should have only one? Should we have simply allowed the Academy to determine all of recombinant DNA policy, and so on? I could repeat the example from the examples that each one of you have said. So I'll just throw that to all of you and ask if you would like to begin by commenting upon that, or comment on anything else you want to say.
So I would just say that, in a way, the Academy got the ball rolling. They responded to the concerns expressed by the people at the Gordon Conference. But very quickly, it became obvious that the National Institutes of Health was in a better position to deal with these issues, that it could draw on the right expertise and so forth. And so everything basically went over to the NIH.
And it's a publicly accountable agency as well.
Yes, but not a regulatory agency, nor indeed was the Academy a regulatory agency, and that made for some tension and is the reason why the ultimate decision was made to establish guidelines for research, which, as far as anybody knows, were adhered to carefully by both university and private laboratories. And that was what NIH did in order to get around the fact that it was not a regulatory agency.
So, since you asked me.
Right, I singled you out.
Yes, you did. Let me do it by appealing to my 15 undergraduate students that I brought to Washington in 1997 to study issues of scientific literacy, and we read the 3-foot pile, well, a big pile of reports everybody had done. And the very first day, when we're a little jet lagged from Arizona, the very first day, these students were very well prepared. And we walked in, and the first day was the National Academy. So we walked in, and we had staff members there. And one of my students, who went on to be one of the leaders in Teach for America and just finished his PhD from Harvard in Education is Changing the World, became very excited about education and said, aren't we wasting resources? And so he asked the Academy people and said, why did you have to do this report when the AAAS had already done it? Why didn't you at least comment on what they had said what was good about what they said, and thereby gain more authority because you've got what they said and you're adding to it? Or maybe you're disagreeing about something and saying how we could do it better. And so it's not that we need one instead of many, but we need not to have a babble of voices sometimes that sound like they're at odds and sound like, as that student put it, is it that you wrote the report because everybody in Washington has to have their own thing or you won't get funded and you won't get credit? So can't we share credit? Can't we build credit? Can't we build a sort of larger sense of agreement?
A valuable clarification. Thank you.
Can I
Ruth?
respond both to your question and to Maxine's
Can we
comment?
speak more
Sorry.
closely to the microphone?
Because I discovered that I had run out of time, I skipped over a part of the recombinant DNA controversy that is pertinent to the question you asked and the comments that Maxine made, namely that the increased number and passion of the calls for public regulation came from members of the public who felt that the scientists were not publicly accountable. They were being paid to do their research by public funds, but there was no mechanism by which they could be made accountable to the public health or to the public. And so the argument ran. The public must exert through government its regulatory authority. And that's what the argument behind the effort of the Cambridge City Council and the Berkeley City Council and ultimately Congress led by Senator Kennedy, which proposed regulatory legislation to come out of Congress to govern or to create the guidelines and to enforce the guidelines, which they felt NIH wasn't capable of doing. Now, those efforts failed, all of them. Some of them succeeded temporarily, but not for long, and others never got approved, for example, the congressional legislation. But the controversy has two sides to it. One is the side that says you should never have made it a public discussion. It should have been resolved privately in in scientific circles, because we've resolved these kinds of problems before without telling the public about them, and we can resolve them again. We can find a vector that's safer than E. coli, which in fact, under NIH funding, is what happened. So there were those, and these were what I found in the archives of the Academy. That is, members of the Academy saying, don't make this public. It's a big mistake, and it's contrary to the way in which science ought to operate. And then on the other side, there were the members of the public, the members of what I'm generally calling consumer advocacy groups, but which also could have been called anti-science groups at the time. And this was the early 70s. The anti-science movement was becoming fairly dominant in American culture in that period of time. And they said, you have no right to do your research paid for by public funds without accountability to the public, which means public regulation. So the controversy was complicated in that way. These are not people who agree that all of what, or even the majority of what scientists have done in the United States has been in the public interest. So there are people, probably not in this room, but nonetheless very organized, who disagree with your judgment that what science does is ultimately in the public interest. And that brings me also to say something about, if you don't mind, what you had to say about the conflict of interest statement. The particular study committee that I was looking at, if it ever had a discussion about balance on tape, it's not in the archives. And I can't reveal which committee it was, and so I can't tell you what the date was on it. But in addition, someone who was appointed to the committee declined to serve on the grounds that he had just started a startup company in which he had a major financial interest in the field. Somebody else who was serving on the committee wrote and said, I've just been invited to be on the board of a not domestic company, but of a startup company which is going to exploit some of my research. So one person felt that his conflict of interest was so severe he couldn't serve, even though he was an expert on the subject. Another person who felt he had a conflict of interest was told by the staff that as long as he wasn't an employee or an owner, he could serve. It wasn't a conflict of interest to serve on the board. The representative from the consumer advocacy group, when she leaked the story of the resignation of the staff member, challenged in print the integrity of the report, which had not yet been written, and on which study committee she continued to serve. In fact, her name is on the ultimate report. And that's what I mean when I say that in your scenario, and I hope it is the most common scenario, conflict of interest statements and discussions do result in nonpartisan consensus achieved by partisan people. But I don't think it always works that way.
Elliot, you want to weigh in here? On this or anything else?
Yeah, only very, very briefly, to respond to one thing that you said and asked about was whether there should be a multiplicity of reports. And of course there should in any democracy. And you mentioned in my introduction that I might have learned something in 2 years in Cambridge. And I will mention two things that I did learn. One of them underlines something that Maxine said, which is the importance of dinner parties. In college or not, and the other is how deeply the people at the Royal Society wish they had a 1,000-person consulting company the same way the National Academy has, and so that our colleagues in a similar society in a different part of the world think that the National Academy reports are extraordinarily important, and they wish very much they were in a position where they could give advice to government in a similar way. And so I think that's an endorsement of National Academy reports, regardless of whether everybody else weighs in with their own reports.
Thank you. I think that it's time now to turn the discussion open to the audience. And we have a member of the audience, and Angela.
Yes, Angela Kreger from Princeton. And I wanted to ask a question. It can be to the whole panel, but it was sparked by Maxine Singer's interesting comments about the recombinant DNA, the genesis of the controversy. And it concerns the ways in which scientists practiced laboratory safeguards before that era. And you mentioned that obviously chemists and microbiologists already had practices, laboratory practice to keep themselves safe and their materials from getting contaminated. It does seem to me that in the 1960s and 70s, it was a new era for safe handling in laboratories because in many cases, federal oversight began to come in and regulate how things were done, or state oversight. And I'm most familiar with the case of nuclear materials, especially radioisotopes, in which laboratories had to be certified for the use and inspected occasionally to see if they were complying with regulations. And I'm wondering whether the transition to that kind of overt and explicit regulation changed the relationship of scientists to the government or to the public in any way, because it does seem to me that's something that makes the late 20th century somewhat distinctive in terms of how scientists actually operated and how they related to government structures.
Maxine?
So I'm not sure I can really answer that, but from what I see watching things in the lab, I would say that people in my generation and somewhat younger have a lot of trouble with a lot of these new regulations, but the young people have none. And they have learned them in school, and they follow them, and if I talk with them and tell them about some of the things I did in the lab, they are in disbelief of what we did. Do I think they're safer than we were? I'm not sure. I'm not sure at all. There you are.
There are two people over there, Naomi and Dick, but I don't know which one of you is, oh, you're closer. Okay,
I'm
Naomi,
standing
go
in
ahead.
front. Naomi Oreskes from Harvard, and I just want to point out an implicit bias right here, right now, which is the height of this microphone, which is obviously designed for a man, but in any event, a tall man. I wanted to delve a little bit more into the question of bias and conflict, because it's clearly a very complicated subject, and I think the vocabulary we have to describe it maybe is not sufficient. But I want to ask especially about this question of using balance to try to address it. Because something that I've observed, I've been on some panels and I've also studied panels, and there's something that I've observed that I want to ask you about. So sometimes on a panel there could be someone who receives a very large amount of funding from an industry that has a strong interest in the outcome of the report. Sometimes even all or essentially all of their funding comes from that industry. And it's generally considered acceptable if it's open and acknowledged and, it's part of the public record. But you almost never see someone whose funding comes almost entirely or largely from an environmental group or a nonprofit or a community group. And of course that's structural because very few community groups have the kind of funding available to support scientific research that, a large industry, pharmaceuticals or whatever, could have. So it seems to me that there's a kind of imbalance that occurs because of the nature of where funding can come from. So that's one thing. And then there's something that's related, but I think more subtle, which is that there are some topics on which it's very difficult to get expertise unless you have a close relationship to industry, just by virtue of access to records or access to sites or access to various different kinds of things. And so some of the experts who are really experts and who belong on the panel by virtue of their expertise have very close social or financial links with industry. And we know that that matters because we know that when you spend time with people, you get to understand their point of view and you may become sympathetic to that point of view. And that could be a good thing. You could understand things that you didn't understand before. But again, there isn't an equivalent thing where we have experts. In most cases, there are some exceptions, but in general, we don't have experts who are experts in part by virtue of their close relationship to community groups or activist groups. And so it seems to me that there could be some evidence that the way we balance panels is in fact not entirely balanced, that it tends, or it may possibly in some cases, skew towards industrial sponsors and not towards, say, the concerns of community groups or environmental activists, just by virtue of these kinds of structural issues. So I wondered if you'd like to comment on that.
I think it's a valid point, certainly, and that balance always has to be considered, although I think lately that, at least in the genetically modified crop sort of reports, which are the ones I read because I'm a plant developmental biologist, there have been real attempts to include people who represent organizations that are fundamentally opposed to any sort of modification of crops. And in some cases, the most recent case that was reported in the New York Times, I know nothing from the Academy itself, was a report where there were accusations of conflict in both directions, where it turned out that the dietitian who worked at Kaiser Permanente objected that two of the other committee members were inappropriate and that one of the people involved who was an agronomy professor, I think, at the University of California, Davis, had a conflict of interest that should have prevented her from being part of the committee because Davis had accepted money at some point from Monsanto. The objections went the other way, that when the committee, the staff, investigated her website, they found out that she was selling her advice and had a consulting company and hadn't revealed this in the conflict of interest discussion. I don't know where the whole thing ended up. I'm sure people here know. It was in the New York Times in April. And so I think there is an attempt to include people from the broader public on the committees, at least these days, although I think it's a pretty new thing. It doesn't always work out smoothly.
Let me just add, Naomi, that in my reading of files at this point, I would guess maybe 150 or 200 study committees. Since World War II, I haven't found a single one that was funded by industry. That is, they...
I'm not suggesting the report was funded by industry, but that's some of the experts.
Ah, okay.
Their research would be funded to some extent or substantially.
Right. Although I will tell you that the two population reports that I referred to in my talk were actually paid for by the Population Council, which is a not-for-profit. It's part, or was then and is now, part of the Rockefeller Foundation. But it was a social movement in and of itself.
Just a quick comment. Balance of what? That's another one of those questions that we need to think about. How do we decide balance across which things, like height or whatever?
Climate change
right.
denialists should be on every panel. There's people from the tobacco industry are being ignored. So it's a difficult issue, but all we can do is try and be reasonable.
Dick. And then Al.
Yes, Professor Meyerowitz called attention to the hazard of the NRC staff shopping around for future reports and perhaps making sure that the report didn't unduly criticize the sponsoring agency. But I mentioned this morning that this 2012 report, Making Sense of Missile Defense, was severely critical of the Missile Defense Agency. You ought to read it. Now, on the other hand, there was the point about people who accept government money for their research should be publicly accountable. I disagree that they should be more accountable than people who do the same kind of research on university or, for that matter, corporate money. We ought to have all the same restrictions on what we do, and the fact that the money comes from the government should not convey its own restrictions on the research. That's my view.
I want to be clear, I wasn't advocating that. I was speaking for those who advocated it at the time.
I object to
Our last question from Alan Needell.
Just a quick question to the historians, or actually to anyone, about changes over time. And the presumption, first of all, that scientific empirical evidence would both be, if it were listened to by the politicians, that they would make good policy, or that it would make, by science literacy, make the population more effective in demanding things from their representatives. Do you sense a change over time in the period from, let's say, the 50s and 60s through the later period?
I'm not clear. Change in what, Alan?
In the presumption that there's a consensus that empirical evidence and scientific rationale is a valid criteria for making public policy.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say,
Yes, there are changes, but it's not a linear change. They're cycles.
well, if I may jump in on this, I think that we have undergone a sea change in discourse over science and policies that are grounded in science and technology, particularly in evidence. It was the case, there are two sort of starting benchmarks. The first is that until the late 60s, most science policy, insofar as it got into public debate, was about defense. Secondly, there were divisions of a political nature in the defense advisory system. The conflict, say, over the hydrogen bomb would be one example, over anti-ballistic missiles would be another. But those tended to be aired, and the issues tended to be, the disputes were really over politics much more than over the content of the technical issues. What has changed, it seems to me, since that period is that, and this is not only the case with hardcore physical, biological science, but broadly across a whole spectrum of technically grounded policy issues, including finance, for example, sociological issues, anthropological issues, and so on, is that first, there has been a proliferation, a diversification of the issues that engage expert information, or expertise and expert information. That is far beyond defense. There's hardly an area of public policy that doesn't touch upon in some profound way science, technology, and so on, and other kinds of expert information, but also the right wing. That is, I don't mean disparagingly here by using that phrase, but say the groups to the right of center, with a variety of interests to the right of center, have discovered that they too could play in this game. And so what we have seen since the 60s is a proliferation of think tanks and other forms of institutions that are, quote, doing research in different areas, that are sponsoring research, that are mobilizing scientific information and so on, and putting it out in public, in the public arena so as to advance their side of the story. In some cases, I would say the tobacco industry is one of them, the advancement has been mainly to cloud the story rather than to clarify it. But what we have now is well, Jane used the word babble, but I don't know if I'd go that far, but certainly a cacophony of conflicting claims about science and technology, scientific and technological information, even excluding the climate deniers, that make it very, very difficult to simply point to one group or another group and say they've got the right answer. And that's because scientific and technological information has become an instrument, if you will, a weapon on all sides of the political ideological spectrum, whereas it had been tended to be confined to one group of topics, defense, and also to be dominated in the main by people who were democratic liberals, New Deal, Fair Deal, democratic liberals in the physics community, for example. It brings me back to the point, though, that the larger point, from my point of view, is that democracy is messy. We live in a Jeffersonian society in that regard, and that the only way through this cacophony is through the contest of debate. All right, and it's a debate where you have to have participants from everywhere, and they have to be persistent, and you can't just give up in the face of the mobilization of alternative positions in science and technology. That's the sea change, it seems to me, that we have undergone in our society, and that's the sea change that we have to learn to swim with, if you will, to carry through that metaphor. Okay, having hogged the last minute or so, if any of you want to comment on this, I will say sure, but we're past time already anyway. Right. So I want to call this session to a close, thank our speakers, thank the audience, and I also want to remind the audience that we have another 4 panels tomorrow focused on infrastructure, health, information, and education, and that translates into radiation hazards, biodemography and vital statistics, computing and information, and science education. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, and thank you and have a good evening.